Well, it was almost a decade after the Puritan government of England had executed Charles I, and the country had begun to descend into chaos. Oliver Cromwell, who ruled as Lord Protector, silenced criticism by banning newspapers, intercepting letters, and employing a network of secret police. In his history of four-footed beasts, serpents, and insects, Reverend Edward Topsell wrote, "Would it not make all men reverence a good king set over them by God, seeing the bees seek out their king if he lose himself by a most intelligent smelling sense, never cease till he be found out, and then bear him upon their bodies if he be unable to fly." Topsell then tried to add a bit of balance by continuing, "And what king is not invited to clemency and deterred from tyranny, seeing the king of bees hath a sting, but never uses the same?" We have no reason to think Topsell was a political dissident. In fact, he may really have simply believed that he was recording the ways of bees. Conscious or not, a subtext comes through, and the English Parliament apparently agreed with it, since 2 years later, in 1660, it invited Charles II, son of the beheaded king, back to rule, requiring, however, that he not use his office for revenge against the regicides. The world of animals appears here parallel to that of human beings, and the differences of species may stand for those of tribe, gender, class, profession, and so on. This is a sort of vision that we associate with totemism, which the anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss explained in the mid-20th century as the application of structures originally found in the natural world, especially among animals, to human culture as a means of representing social distinctions among indigenous peoples. Apart from the vastness of their scale and the complexity of their organization, nations are essentially tribes, and the relations between them follow many of the same dynamics. Animal symbolism is so deeply embedded in human culture that it is almost impossible to talk about animals without simultaneously speaking indirectly of human beings. Lévi-Strauss's notion of totemism has been qualified, challenged, and refined by subsequent thinkers, but without trying to tease out all the possible implications, it still serves as a rough working model for understanding how animals and natures may contribute to cultural diplomacy. This is apparent in the beast fables from the tradition of Aesop, a half-legendary storyteller from the Greek Isle of Samos in the 7th century BCE. Several of the stories commonly attributed to him, such as the tortoise and the hare or the fox and the grapes, are still familiar to contemporary people from childhood. Behind the moralistic tales of talking lions and foxes, we can discern a tribal religion with its animal totems, deities, sages, and tricksters, largely deprived of their numinous qualities, yet, nevertheless, in ways not terribly different from those of many indigenous people of Africa or the Americas. From very early times, the fable has been primarily, though by no means exclusively, a form associated with slaves. Aesop himself, Phaedrus, and Babrius, the three most celebrated fabulists of the ancient world, were all slaves, as was Uncle Remus, the mouthpiece for Afro-Indian tales in the Aesopian tradition collected by Joel Chandler Harris in the deep south of the United States just after the Civil War. The fable enabled slaves, as well as other people, to indirectly express things which might otherwise be sensitive or forbidden. Totemism became even more overt in the High Middle Ages with the development of heraldry. This was initially a system of emblems painted on shields to identify knights in jousts when their faces and bodies were completely covered by armor. In the most literal way, heraldic symbols were a substitute for the human face. Heraldry was gradually extended to feudal families, then to states, businesses, clubs, and almost all other institutions. These symbols were by no means confined to animals and vegetation, but creatures such as boars, wolves, bears, lions, and eagles figured very prominently. Heraldry represented identity in terms of abstract relationships among symbolic objects which are joined in fantastic patterns with no regard for common sense. They are deliberately esoteric, pointing to the mystery which is ultimately at the core of identity. In some contexts, at least, modern societies have identified with animals with a constancy comparable to that of tribal peoples. These creatures need not necessarily be indigenous, wild, contemporary, or even real. England is represented by a lion, which is not indigenous, or a bulldog, which is a domestic breed. The animal representing Mauritius is the extinct dodo, while Scotland is represented by the mythical unicorn. Those are simply animals that, whether for historic, folkloric, commercial, or geographic reasons, seem to embody a nation's uniqueness. Underlying this totemic practice is an implicit analogy between the diversity of human cultures and that of all living things. The animals in fables of the Renaissance, such as those of La Fontaine and of political cartoons, are essentially those of heraldry. The totemic notion that animals constitute a world parallel to that of people was also responsible for the practice of physiognomy, which held that the character of a person could be read by the resemblance of his features to certain animals. So there would be wolf people, pig people, bat people, and so on. That tradition, without the theoretical underpinnings, continues in caricatures and, most especially, political cartoons up through the present day, as well as in literary works such as Orwell's Animal Farm. One might perhaps think that the stylized animals of literary fables, heraldry, and editorial cartoons are too detached from their original models for their representation to have much impact on relations between human beings and the natural world. Experience suggests otherwise. Numerous animals that were on the brink of extinction in the early 20th century have not only come back but become so numerous that, while not long ago they were rare enough to seem like wonders, many people have once again begun to think of them as pests. White-tailed deer, turkeys, and Canada geese may now be more common in the United States and Canada than they were in pre-Columbian times. Bald eagles, moose, beaver, buffalo, and coyotes are making significant comebacks as well. These resurgent animals are precisely those that have great iconic importance in both Amerindian and immigrant cultures. The bald eagle is the national animal of the United States and the beaver of Canada. The turkey is an old symbol of the New World, the buffalo of the Great Plains, and the moose of the far north. All of the others as well are closely identified with certain regions, landscapes, or peoples. To be sure, iconic status in human culture can often endanger animals. In the United States, immediately following the Civil War, the American buffalo were deliberately hunted almost to extinction in order to dishearten the Plains Indians, in whose lives they had a central role. In Asia today, the South China tiger is being hunted to extinction in large part because of the central role that its body parts play in folk medicine. The mediation performed by animals in human affairs is continuous, if seldom noticed, like the sound of crickets on an autumn day. In the past, this process has occasionally emerged from the background, as when Harun al-Rashid gifted 2 leopards to Charlemagne, or in 1972, when the government of China presented a mated pair of pandas to the National Zoo in Washington, D.C. It is hard to say how much ecological awareness, if any, is reflected by either of these gifts, but the presents were at least a reminder to the recipient that the distant land contained not only wealth and people, but also natural wonders. My broader point is that environmental problems are also cultural. In fact, one cannot address the one apart from the other. In general, we can say that the representation of people in terms of animals and nature, an essentially totemic tradition, can place human concerns in a broader perspective, diffusing tensions and helping us to A, look beyond immediate personal or collective interests. B, comment indirectly on subjects that might otherwise be taboo. C, unite people around shared concerns such as conservation or sustainability. Like other forms of cultural diplomacy, this may remain primarily beneath the threshold of awareness, but can be made more effective through conscious appreciation. Topsel was not the only person who used bees to comment on human institutions. Socrates, in Plato's dialogue Phaedo, suggested that people who lived as good citizens might be reincarnated as bees. Virgil upheld bees to his fellow Romans as models of austere living and martial valor, especially because they would sting intruders at the cost of their own lives. In the Middle Ages, people often thought of the hive as a sort of monastery, but in the early modern period, Bernard de Mandeville satirized it as an imperiled feudal state that had failed to adopt to the ways of commerce, a notion that eerily anticipates the way honeybees are dying out today. At the beginning of the 20th century, Maurice Maeterlinck stated that bees were the most intelligent animals after man and thought of them as socialists. On learning that the so-called king was actually a queen, some feminists have upheld the hive as a model of matriarchal society. What mediates among these different social systems and philosophies? Of course, the bees. The borders between nations are mapped out with great precision, but boundaries among cultures are fundamentally poetic. Literary, artistic, and architectural accomplishments help to distinguish human cultures from one another. Interaction with the natural world, also embodied in customs from funerals to foodways, further differentiates them from domains that are still largely beyond human understanding or control. These frontiers, in turn, are constantly in flux, a bit like wetlands that shift with the weather, season, and tide. True. It certainly is true that it's easier to care for animals than to care for human beings. And one manifestation of that was Nazi Germany, which had the strongest animal protection laws in the world and was very militantly against cruelty to animals. I think, though, caring is just one thing among many. I think that it's also a question not just of caring, but also of representation and understanding. By talking about animals, sometimes when topics are just too hot to handle, otherwise, people can develop a certain rapport and a certain sense of common interest, and then move on to interpersonal relationships, which are usually much more complex and in certain ways much more difficult. But I think even when this is not done consciously, when we talk about animals which are in ways so much like us and yet at the same time so totally different, we are considering different possibilities, and we are extending our imagination.